So my next question is concerned somewhat with how Buddhism has found its way to, if you like, the West, or to the cultures that you both have grown up in. One of the characteristics of Zen and Buddhism finding its way into these cultures is that we're kind of recreating it a bit. We're finding its own forms. It's finding its own forms here. So the question is to what extent are forms of practice necessary or important in the practice of Zen, and do the particular forms themselves matter? Does it matter what those forms are? To what degree does it matter? And so I'll ask that question first of all, if I may, to Stephen, and then we'll come to Brad afterwards.
I have a very ambivalent relationship to forms of practice and institutions and meditation structures and so on. I greatly value them, is the first thing I want to say. And, you know, I would not be sitting here talking to you now if those forms and those structures had not been maintained and developed over hundreds of years by people, people in Asia, in Korea, in China, India. So I have a great respect for the continuity of those structures. And I have a respect for the fact that these structures are not there just arbitrarily because somebody liked the idea of them, but they're there because over generations they've been found to work. They've been found to support the practice of the Dharma. And particularly in training, when I was in the monastery in Korea, for example, I valued enormously the actual physical structures, the buildings, the aesthetic, the geomancy that apparently decided where the monastery would be located in relation to the hills and the forests around. All of that, I feel, has a great power in a sense, contextualizing what we do when we sit in Zazen. So therefore, I'm very, very alert to all of that. But at the same time, I'm aware that when we're not in Korea or Japan or whatever, and we're finding ourselves, say, in England or France or in Los Angeles, these traditional structures can often feel somehow out of place. They somehow feel like an intrusion into a different cultural sphere. And they tend to, in a way, sort of stand for a kind of ghettoized little religious group with its nice little Japanese-style temple in the midst of the sprawl of Los Angeles, or whatever it might be. And there I feel that has already radically changed the organic growth of these structures and institutions over many centuries in a very specific culture, and has been exported somewhat uncritically and then planted into a Western or a non-traditional setting. And that's always happened, and I think that's inevitable. And I can fully understand that. But if we step back and we look at the Buddhist tradition from a larger historical perspective, we see that Buddhism is very good at reinventing itself each time it goes into a new environment. So the temples you find in Japan, for example, have no real reference back to an Indian or a Tibetan style temple or monastery. It's adapted itself seamlessly to fit with the societies and the aesthetic norms and other values that we find, say, in Japan. And obviously, if the Dharma is to find a similar home in modernity in the West, over time it too will adapt. And I think there's a danger that we sort of try to push that too hard and think we've got to sort of come up with our own form. I think that these forms are in many ways the outcome of generations of people engaging in these practices, and perhaps imperceptibly that gives rise to new ways of imagining the spaces and the structures and the forms of our practice. So I think we find ourselves in Europe or in America at a kind of transitional moment. We're not, we often are borrowing elements from East Asia, for example. And yet we're also aware that, we're not living in East Asia, we're living somewhere quite different. And, but I think we need to respect the organic growth of communities and persons within those communities as what over time will give rise to forms that will be more naturally adapted to the sort of world that we live in. That's all I really have to say.
Thank you, Stephen. So same question to you, Brad. What do you see forms of practice as being necessary in practicing Zen? And again, do you feel that the type of form matters?
Yeah, well, thank you. I so much agree with everything Stephen just said that I don't want to risk just restating what he said. So I'm trying to, as he's talking, I'm trying to think what else can I say, because I think he just said it very well, what the situation is and how this stuff has come to us. So I don't know, maybe I can just say something about my personal experience of that, if that might be relevant, because I started off studying Zen Buddhism in Kent, Ohio, which is a little university town in Northeast Ohio, in just a house that my first teacher, Tim McCarthy, had rented, and it was we repurposed the living room as a Zendo. So it wasn't, his teacher had been Japanese, but it wasn't a very Japanese looking space. It just looked like an ordinary living room, in America. And his approach to practice was, Koben Chino was an interesting fellow in that he was originally brought over to America by Shunryu Suzuki to help figure out how to make the San Francisco Zen Center more conform to the Japanese traditional style of doing things, because Koben knew that very well. And he did that, and he helped establish all these forms at the San Francisco Zen Center. But once he got off on his own, he stayed in America and started teaching, he mostly discarded all that. I mean, I never actually met Koben myself, but this is what I got from Tim. So he didn't do much of that. He did it. He kind of adapted himself to the American way of doing things, and got rid of all the traditions. So Tim had learned that style, and he didn't do much of the traditional stuff or do it in the traditional setting. We just sat zazen. Occasionally we'd do a chant of the Heart Sutra. That was pretty much it for the forms. The form of zazen is important, but maybe I can get back to that or circle around to that. But so after doing this, I'm sort of truncating my history a little bit, but after doing this for 10 years, on and off, whatever it happened to be, I moved to Japan. And then and got a job, as you said in my introduction, with the company that made, founded by the guy who invented Godzilla. And I found a teacher in Japan, Gudo Nishijima Roshi. And he's an interesting fellow too, in that he taught somewhat in a similar way to Tim and to Koben Chino, but for different reasons. He thought that what had happened in Japan is that the Zen had become very, is the word moribund? I'm reluctant to use big words because I don't know what they mean. But it become very, it become kind of like a almost a play. People understood the traditions. The Zen people in Japan would drill themselves on, various ceremonies and various chants and all this sort of stuff like that, and get very good at it. So they were professionals at doing that, but it was kind of a hollow thing. There wasn't anything behind it. They didn't understand why they were doing this. There was not much philosophy behind it. Zazen had kind of fallen off because Zazen isn't really a ritually perform in front of people, so they don't really do much Zazen. They just do the ceremonies and things. So Nishijima Roshi had studied with Kodo Sawaki, who had also found the same problems in Japanese Zen, and Kodo Sawaki taught, he just would do Zazen. He'd do very, very little else other than Zazen. So that was the practice. You did this style of zazen, and you did zazen in the traditional way, but pretty much everything else, it didn't matter. It didn't matter if you did it in a temple. It didn't matter if you knew the chants. You know, you didn't have to do all that ceremonial stuff. So next part of my story is that after living in Japan for 11 years, I moved back to the United States, and I started a little Zen group here in Los Angeles. I came back because the film production company I worked for, wanted to have an office in Los Angeles. So I didn't really come back here to start a Zen organization. But, you know, I had enough free time, and I was already ordained by that point. So I started this group, and at first I did it the way Tim had done it and the way Nishijima Roshi had done it, in a really bare bones style where, you know, whatever you want to dress like, whatever you want to do, we're just doing zazen, that's it. And then, and then I went to Tassajara, which is a Zen monastery that I don't know if I mentioned it by name, but it's a Zen monastery established by the San Francisco Zen Center up in the Carmel Valley of California. And I've never done a practice period there, but I spent several summers there. And they do a very traditional Japanese practice, which is much more like the traditional Japanese Zen practice than I even experienced in Japan, because of the teacher that I had, who kind of, you know, didn't care too much about that stuff. So I did all the formal bowing and the bells and the rituals and all that. So, you know, every morning you get up and you do this whole big ritual. You do zazen first for an hour, and then you do this incredibly elaborate sort of Japanese style Zen ritual, and you do it every day with all the chants and all the bells and all the movement and all that other stuff. And I thought, this is kind of good. this is I like this. This has some merit to it. So I had Greg Fain, who was the what do they call him, Tanto, which is head of practice there. I became friends with him, and he, you know, I said, here, show me how to do this stuff, you know. And I spent a lot of time with him on any free time that we had, going to the Zendo and having him show me how to do this stuff, because I'd never learned any of this sort of traditional Japanese style ritual practice. And then I started doing it with my group in Los Angeles, and a lot of them hated it. and I kind of thought, oh, the fact that you hate this tells me that maybe you kind of need it. You know, it may be useful. The resistance I was feeling from some of this group toward it made me feel like maybe this is something I should pursue. So I brought in a lot more of this traditional stuff that neither of my formal Zen teachers had bothered with. And I kind of feel like at this point we've hit a nice sort of middle ground between being more American style and with less formality. And the Angel City Zen Center, such as it is, the physical space of it is a house in Los Angeles. It's pretty much the same sort of thing that I encountered with Tim McCarthy. That we just emptied out the living room and made it into a space you could do zazen and a few ceremonies in. So physically, it just looks like an ordinary sort of blue house in America, in Los Angeles. But we're trying to do some of the more ritual stuff and those forms, and I think they're useful. But as Stephen said, we're in the infancy of this. You know, it's barely been in the West for 50 years. Well, you know, you could stretch that out 60 or 70 years. It's really hasn't been around for even a century here, and so it's going to take time to find the right way to do it that works for everyone. And maybe, you know, it'll never work for everyone, but, you know, some sort of Western style, some sort of European style or American style of Zen has yet to emerge, but, you know, we're just finding our way around it. But I think it's good to honor those traditions. And as Stephen said, you know, the reason that he encountered it and that I encountered is because those traditions existed, and because people cared about them and maintained them for century after century. And because they work. You know, that's a kind of you probably have to add a lot of qualifiers to that statement, but they've been honed. I always like to use the term research and development. You know, they've gone through a lot of research and development over what works and what doesn't for people in various cultures, because a lot of us in the West forget how different China, Japan, Korea, Tibet, these places are very, very different from each other. You know, we sort of look at it as this one monolithic Asian thing, but that's not the case at all. So if it can adapt from India to Japan, which would be two very, very different cultures, it can adapt from, you know, Japan or wherever to the United States or England, or, you know, wherever it lands. So